Today we would like to move forward and introduce our moderator. And we have a panel that's been changed, and it's just like space, it's always changing. The only one on the panel, I think, is we had David Webb originally, we had Bob Zubrin, and we have a couple new players with us, and they'll be introduced. So we're going to move on. This is going to be a lively session, free flow type thing, which we're used to. And Alex Howerton is going to be our moderator, and he's coming to us. He gave me a word, but I went brain dead, and I have him explain his background, and we'll let him flow into it and give a little promo on yourself and Alex. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Alex Howerton. I'm Space Business Editor of Countdown Magazine. And this is a panel on private launch concepts and what's going on in that arena. We have three panelists here. Dr. David Webb, formerly of the NASA program, National Aerospace Plane, and formerly a member of the Payne Commission on Space, and Ben Muniz, who is a member of the Board of Directors of National Space Society, president of the California Space Development Council, and in his spare time, he's an engineer for a major aerospace corporate company who shall remain nameless. And then we have Dr. Robert Zubrin, who is currently working with Lockheed Martin Astronautics, and I'm sure a lot of you know of him through his Mars Direct efforts. So each of these will get up and make a presentation, and then we'll open the discussion afterwards as an open panel. So save your questions for a group discussion afterwards. We'll start out with Ben Muniz here, who has some comments on private launch vehicles.
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon. Recently, Congressman Dan Rohrabacher was talking about the NASA budget, and he used the term Wai Qi, which is a Chinese term that talks about means the crisis of change. And the pictogram for that is a combination of a pictogram for danger and opportunity. And as Dr. Webb told us last night, and others have told us for a while, our space program does currently face a major crisis. The Cold War rationale that was responsible for the creation of NASA is essentially gone. And so we have to look for new ways to do space. One of the ways that a lot of people have talked about doing it is to bring in the private sector and make them a player in fields other than just, say, communication satellites. At the same time, there's increased recognition by many people that high launch costs are really the key barrier to enabling the kind of space development that we all want to see. Now, there are many space advocate groups and individuals who are looking for ways to help enable private companies build and operate launch vehicles. The way we're doing that is holding panels like this one, close to the belly of the beast, if you will. NASA Lewis is right down the road. They're responsible for the expendable launch vehicle program for NASA. We reach out to the media. A lot of you picked up the free copy of Space News. If you read the commentary on page 16 by Charles Miller, Executive VP of the California Space Development Council, I gotta get that plug in there somehow, talks about what we want to see in terms of space. We also look at supporting legislation to help enable this. For example, the Launch Services Purchase Act that was passed in 1990 prohibits NASA from launching and operating its own launch vehicles, especially in competition with any private sector involvement. Now, that was the brainchild of just a few members of San Diego 05 and Tucson Space Society, both chapters of the National Space Society. And with the help of a lot of other people, that got passed into legislation. That changed one way of doing space that existed for a generation. What did that accomplish? Well, if you look at the same Space News, I saw some people reading the article on page 3 about McDonnell Douglas unveils its Delta upgrade. What basically happened is Hughes Space and Communications has pledged about $1.5 billion to help McDonnell Douglas develop the Delta III launch vehicle. And the reason they can do that is that they know that NASA cannot go to, say, with apologies to my colleague, Lockheed Martin, and say, hey, we'll help you build a competitor to this vehicle and we'll help you operate that vehicle. Hughes knows that that cannot happen. NASA cannot do that. So they're able to provide private sector money for that. Now CSDC and other groups want to see not just the letter of that Launch Services Purchase Act, but the spirit of that law upheld. We've come out against programs like the X-34 program, because we see that as an operational vehicle that is being funded in part by NASA through a direct subsidy. And we're not the only ones who are saying that. If you read the press releases from NASA, from Rockwell, from Orbital Sciences, they say it is an operational vehicle. And we think that is not the way to go about doing this. We support the X-33 program, which we see as doing the cutting edge research and development to help enable a reusable launch vehicle. But at the same time, we oppose any effort to make the X-33 into Shuttle 2. We want to see it a research and development program. Now that's all of the sexy stuff, the launch vehicle stuff. There's other legislation that's pending that we have to, as an activist community, think about. For example, H.R. 1631, which was recently introduced by Representative Andrea Seastrand from California, is a bill to help enable the development of commercial spaceports by providing tax incentives and regulatory measures to help stimulate private investment in spaceports in California, in Florida, in Alaska. And we invite you, California Space Development Council invites you to our next meeting, September 23rd, at the California Commercial Spaceport in Lompoc, California. So we're looking for ways to help the private sector get involved in space. And they will come, because as I said in the beginning about danger and opportunity, there is an economic danger for these companies. They may lose their money, but there's an enormous economic opportunity for them as well, just as Hughes has shown. Thank you.
Next up is Dr. David Webb. And again, he was formerly the National Aerospace Plane Thing, and he has a unique perspective on the issues.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry about all this ridiculous introduction. Let's leave the NASP out of it, except from this point of view. We learned an awful lot on NASP. It was a shame the program got scrambled, got caught up in too many bureaucrats, too many cooks, too many chiefs, too few engines, and it failed. But the only thing is we did learn a lot. One of the problems that we are faced with right now in these United States is the fact that our technology base is slipping and slipping badly, and it's slipping badly vis-a-vis competition. The only way that this is going to be kept up is by NASA becoming an R&D agency, which we've just heard is finally becoming an official pronouncement and not before it was due. If it goes back to being a research and development agency, then the private sector, it is going to turn into what NACA, its predecessor, was to the aviation industry. And what NASA should be doing is the research and development, which is going to take us out to the next step, where the private sector will go to NASA to test new theories, new concepts, and everything else, which they are going to fund, and they are going to develop the vehicles, and we are finally going to go to space the way we should have gone all of these years, and which you heard me yabber on about last night, those of you who were here. So I won't go into that anymore, except to say this. I don't think that we should start in the space movement at this time, with all due respect to the speaker here, in arguing about what vehicle is getting what money. We can argue about that vehicle being holding up the X-33. If the X-34 is going to be a precursor to the X-33, then it's absolute nonsense. And when that should not be allowed, it should have no relationship whatever. The fact is that these vehicles must be developed and must be developed as quickly as possible. We always seem to think that we're the only ball game in town. We've got to remember that in the past 10 years, we lost 66% of the Western launch space program. 66% gone down the tubes. We will lose the next 30% if we don't get on the ball. And we cannot go on arguing about who's getting what or where or why or when. We need action, and we need it now. And we need to support every individual space vehicle we can support, including the X-34. If it reduces the cost of going to space by a factor of 3, that's at least a step in the right direction. It's a better step than anything that we have had in the last 20 years. So obviously we should support it. It'd be much better if we can go the Clipper route and we can get a factor of 10 reduction. But we've got to get on with it, and to do that, we've got to keep incredible pressure on the government all the time about deregulating access to space, taking away all the demands and the regulations of all the stupid things like the ATF and the customs and excise. I mean, everything that goes to space when it lands back on Earth is a customs problem. It's due to be taxed again. I mean, come on, what is this? We need to be able to get pressure on the government. We've singularly failed in the space community to do that. Gingrich and Walker are open to that. And sure, they're Republicans, but you know, you can use anybody if you have to. Sorry, yes, anyway, whatever. But seriously, we need to be able to give them some support. In their own party, they have many people who want to stop all of this stuff. Actually, they don't mind if they stop the entire space program. And let's be aware of that. We are in a tremendous race with ourselves, with the French, with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Indians, if you please, who have got built 2 launch vehicles in the past 5 years. That's 2 more than we've done. And we need to get going before we just simply hand the whole access to space over to other countries. So all I say is, let's do it, and let's do it together. And we in the space community must get our act together. We cannot afford to start fighting over whether it's got wings or whether it hasn't got wings. What it is, whether it's single stage, 2 stage, or whatever, if it reduces the cost of going to space, it's good. And we will learn. I mean, every journey starts with the first step. And so let's do it.
Next up is Dr. Robert Zubrin, very simply, Mars Direct.
Well, if you want to hear about Mars Direct, come on Sunday, I'll talk about it there. A few comments on the issue of launch vehicles. First of all, I couldn't agree more with what David Webb has said about not launching campaigns to cut down programs that are developing new launch vehicles that are in fact taking significant steps. I think that this campaign against X-34 is extremely misconceived. This is a program that's going to develop a reusable launch vehicle, an airplane that can do Mach 12. Okay, we all cheered for DCX, that was subsonic. This will cut the price of launching small payloads from $12 million down to $5 million. That's a real step. And furthermore, if you look at the program, it's $75 million of government money spread over 3 years. That's a total amount of money for every American of 30 cents. Okay, not per year, but that's 10 cents a year for 3 years. I think the country can afford it. And it'll be done in 3 years, which is an excellent timeline. And in my view, this is a model for real accomplishment on a short timeline. And in fact, what I would like to do is, in view of the small amount of money here, so I'd like to see that program expanded, not in terms of more funding for X-34, but in terms of making matching funds available for a lot more different concepts. In other words, the fact that private money was willing to be risked in this is a strong justification, as it were, for the government sinking some money in. There are various things one can say about the technical concept of X-34. That if I was designing it, I would have done it differently. Almost any engineer will always do something different than another engineer. We can see vertical takeoff ones and all sorts of things. And if they did that, if they expanded that program by a factor of 10, so it was $250 million a year, it'd still be only 2% of NASA's budget to develop a whole raft of novel types of launch vehicles employing and demonstrating new kinds of technologies in a commercial arena. And we could see which could really show their stuff and be demonstrating in action that they were the bridge towards the frontier. Now, beyond that, there's another aspect, okay? We have two problems with space right now. One is that what we can launch costs too much. And the other is that we can't launch things that are big enough to do things that are really important, at least really important to me. Look, okay, let's get real here, all right? If you're developing commercial launch vehicles in the context that we've been discussing here so far, you're going to look at the satellite launch market and looking at small satellites, medium satellites, large satellites. You look at payloads between 100 pounds and 10,000 pounds, roughly speaking, in orders of magnitude. That's where it's at. In micro, smallish satellites, up to teledesic class satellites, and on to major direct TV broadcast satellites, things like that. And that's all nice and fine. That's business, that's markets. You can make money doing that. But how many of us really got excited about space because of the fact that it could make available live TV transmission coast to coast? Okay, this is not what it's all about. And frankly, all these different communications technologies can be done with fiber optic cables or other things. And if there's a difference of 0.1% of cost, that well, so what, right? I mean, it means you have 0.1% more commercials on your TV if they do it one way as opposed to the other. To me, the reason for going into space is to expand human civilization into space, to the moon, to Mars, beyond, okay? And so I think that not only do we need new launch vehicles that can more cheaply launch satellites of various sizes, but I want to see new launch vehicles that can launch things that are relevant to sending humans to the moon and Mars. Okay, I want to see heavy lift launch vehicles. Okay, launch vehicles in the 100-ton to LEO class. Okay, that is not a class that is required for commercial launch services as such. Okay, but I do think that they can be developed in a commercial way. I think, many of you may have seen in the current Ad Astra, there is a occasional paper called A Call for an American Mars Program. And what that paper outlines is a series of prizes of several $1 billion each for various technical accomplishments up to and onto a human mission to Mars, which itself has a $20 billion prize, posted by the government. Okay, in other words, there's a prize there, I forget the exact number, but like $3 billion, something like that, for development of a heavy lift launch vehicle that can launch 120 tons to LEO, I think was the number. And then, so if you were pursuing that Mars prize, the first thing you would do is develop your heavy lift launch vehicle, and you would do it on your own nickel. And it wouldn't be subject to the vagaries of congressional funding. This year, should we fund the program? Next year, should we not fund the program? Lay off half your workers, rehire them, okay, get started again. No, you're just going after it, and the government's not laying out a cent until the program is completed and completed successfully, okay? Then you got your launch vehicle. Then the next prize, I think, was to throw 50 tons on trans-Mars injection, on a trajectory that takes it to Mars. Well, if you've got your heavy lift vehicle, that's not that hard to do, so you go after that prize. Then the next prize is to be able to land 30 tons on Mars softly, okay, for another several $1 billion, okay? You've got your transportation system, you can do that. And then the next prize is to fly a humans to Mars mission, which you're more or less capable of doing once you have those transportation capabilities. What I'm saying is, if you had prizes like that set, then you could have consortia formed in the private sector to aggressively pursue those prizes. And those companies, okay, which could be existing aerospace companies, or they could be completely new players coming in with a bank account from, you know, Saudi Arabia or Bellevue, Washington, or wherever, okay, said, we're going to chase this, we're going to develop new launch vehicle, okay? Now, we're not going to develop this launch vehicle on a cost-plus basis, okay, where the more the program costs, the more profit we get, because we get to charge 10% profit more than the program costs, okay? We're going to develop this launch vehicle on the basis that it will cost as little as possible, because the prize is fixed, and our profit is simply the prize minus our costs, period. Okay, and if we can do this program for half the cost of the prize, we'll get 100% profit. Okay, so you develop a launch vehicle and a whole industry supporting it in terms of production of engines and everything, which is on a true minimum cost basis and not on a cost plus basis, which is the basis of the existing aerospace industry, the space industry. And if you do that, in other words, what you would do with a set of prizes of this type is not merely get humans to Mars, okay? That you would do, and that would be great, and I want to do that. But what you would do in the process is you would create a true private space industry from the top all the way down, okay? From the top in terms of heavy lift capability and in terms of production of space life support systems and spacesuits and all sorts of gear, right down to the production of subcomponents, engines and valves and actuators and you name it. Okay, and on that basis, you would have the ability to get humans to the moon or Mars with fantastically reduced costs relative to the existing infrastructure. And not only that, we'd be there. So that's my vision of where we want to be going. Thanks.
Thank you, speakers. And now I'd like to open it up for discussion. And I'd like to start with a question here, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't go rambling on here. There's been a lot of talk that the proposed launch vehicles we're talking about here can't accommodate the present market as it's outlined. But as the launch costs come down, isn't it true that the new applications will become feasible and be developed, and thus creating positive price elasticity? I mean, after all, no matter how glamorous these technologies are, aren't they after all just trucks? And isn't the real issue what you're going to carry in the trucks? Once the actual delivered goods like DirecTV and global mobile satellite systems kick in, won't that lead to a renewed interest in developing low-cost launches? Comments on that?
Stand up to this? Can you guys hear me in the back? Yeah. The short answer is yes. David Thompson, who's the CEO, I believe, of Orbital Sciences, has said himself.
Here's the mic.
David Thompson from Orbital Sciences himself has said that you do not size a bridge for truck traffic based on the number of people who are swimming the river. And it's true, market elasticity will definitely take place, and there are all kinds of services that will be out there that will come along that we cannot even envision right now if you get the private sector involved, if you bring the launch costs down to the point where you can get the entrepreneurs involved. And that's the message that Newt Gingrich gave to the space seminar back in March. Just a real quick comment on something Dr. Webb said about us talking to Congress, us getting involved. there was a group of activists who spent money out of their own pocket, took their own vacation to go to Washington, D.C. to help support the X-33 program and educate congressmen and their staffers on the program. I just want those people to stand up right now. David Anderman, Ransom Wooler, Mike Henney, anybody else I forgot, Joe Gillen. Okay, these are the people who are willing to break. And you can, lots of us like to discuss the technical details about vertical landing versus horizontal, but that's not really important. The important thing is to get the message out there. The important thing is for you to write letters and to talk to the media, to Congress, etc. So, sorry for the little plug.
Any other comments on that?
Yeah. Yes, of course, the market is going to double, triple, quadruple. When we did the study for the NAS program, we did the socio-political implications of introducing a NAS vehicle, a NAS type vehicle, into the US launch fleet in the year 2004. It was a classified study because, of course, the military don't understand that, if it goes along the table this way, you have a stamp, you've got to stamp it. But anyway, frankly, it didn't deserve to be classified. But the fact of the matter is that what we came up with in a total econometric survey of what exists now and what is projected out to the future, that you would start with 6 NAS airplanes and you would have 60, you would need 60 in 5 years, and you'd need 120 in 10 years. To keep up with the incredible acceleration of the market that would occur as the satellite manufacturers understood that you can downsize satellites and that you can decomplex satellites, that you don't have to spend $150 million or $250 million on building a satellite out of super alloys and titanium and covered in gold foil and everything else, when you can launch the next morning. If you can launch a spare the next morning, what the hell? It doesn't matter anymore. And the reduction in cost goes right through the whole system. It is absolutely astonishing what happens when you start reducing the cost down to what the NAS was cost at, equivalent of what the Delta Clipper was looking at about $6 million a flight. You get that, you've got everything. We're going to space in the biggest way. And of course, on top of that, Harry Stein and his group in the NAS program also did a whole study on the tourism aspects and what it would do. And of course, obviously, if the Delta Clipper gets going, tourism is going to be a huge money spinner. As it is, it's the biggest industry in the world today, and it will certainly be the biggest industry in space within 5 years or 10 years of us developing a vehicle to do it. It's quite evident. As a matter of fact, as some of you probably know, the X-34 already has a passenger module being designed for it. So just think about it. We're going to go this way. And it's a whole new ballgame. All we need to do is to get off the damn ground. And we've been talking about this for 20 years. It's really time we got around to doing it.
And Dr. Webb, you talked about you being going to support everything. I've been working in the political field for a long time trying to push some of this stuff, and I tell you, I don't think that's realistic. We're not going to have the money to push all these vehicles that everybody wants to build. We've got to be selective. I think if we push X-33 and X-34, we maybe will get one of them. We're not going to get both of them. It's not even clear that we'll get either.
Did everybody hear that? No. Okay, he was saying that basically he doesn't agree that we can afford to do this, and we can't do all the vehicles that we are talking about. And of course we can't. And I think that perhaps, I don't know whether you were here last night, but I was trying to cover this in my talk last night. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute we're getting the government to fund these. The fact of the matter is that what we first have to do is to get to the government to deregulate our access to space and the regulations that are governing it, so that we then can go to Wall Street and say, We are now operating a transportation system that is exactly the same as any other transportation system, except we go an awful lot shorter distance. We only go 150 miles there and back, and we should be worth double the money just for that, because we're only going to have half the risk of somebody going 300 miles. But seriously, we will be able to open up the private sector investment money if we can just simply demonstrate that we've got a level playing field with the kind of transportation systems that we have on Earth now.
Okay, but then isn't X-34 with a pretty much direct government subsidy and pretty much...
Yes, X-34
Is that exactly the wrong thing to do that? If you want to deregulate things, isn't that the wrong thing to do?
The fact is that it has been done, you see, and if we now are going to go to the government and say, hey, we don't think you should do that, what are we telling the government that they should do? It's done. Let's let it go. If OSC gets away with it, fine. It doesn't matter who it is. Just so long, I mean, they're going to demonstrate something with that money, and it will be very quickly outdated if we're going to get proper money to do it. What we need to do is get the politics straight. We'll really mess up and muddle the issues if we now go there and say, please give the money back and don't do that anymore. We want something else, in my personal opinion. Look,
So you say we should do what you say is the wrong thing to do, but let's stop that?
no, I didn't say it was the wrong thing to do. I never said that if the government wants to give money to develop vehicles, that is fine. That is fine. That's the government point of view. If the taxpayer agrees with it, that is fine. What I'm saying is we need far more vehicles and we need to get the private sector involved. The government can do what they want. I mean, this is not the problem that we're facing here. The problem we are facing is the government is stopping other people doing it.
Because they're subsidizing certain...
No, not because they're subsidizing other things. It's simply because they have got so many regulations because it is militarized. That was the problem right from the very start. We've got to now decide that space is going to be open to access by the people. It was closed to access by the people because it was, for national security reasons, it was a military issue. And it's gone away. And that's the problem. We haven't made the shift. And in the space community, let's forget about who gives the money. Government gave money to the Amtrak. Government has given money to the airplanes. Government has given money to all sorts of people. Let's not argue about that. Let's get them to take away the regulations that stop the private sector going to space. That is what we need to do.
So you don't see then these direct government payments to certain companies as inhibiting other companies from entering the field?
Oh, the other companies may see this as inhibiting them, in which case, you know, that is a competitive advantage that OSC may get for 2 or 3 years, maybe. And that's all. And I mean, if you don't want to compete, if the heat's too great in the kitchen, you get out. The problem is that we can't stop and say, you should give money to McDonnell Douglas and Boeing to build the X-33, but you shouldn't give money to Orbital Sciences to build the X-34 because they're different. Now you try explaining that to a government man, and you try and explain that to the public. All you're going to succeed in doing is complicate the situation incredibly in the minds of the people, and they say, what the hell's the matter with these space people? They're never happy. We give them money on one hand, they say, no, we don't want that. We give it to somebody else and they say, yeah, you should double it.
Bravo.
I'm not exactly asking a question.
Ben would like to follow up on this.
I really do not want to turn this into a debate on X-34. But obviously there are two sides of the issue, and we can discuss this at the hostility suite later on. But the fundamental idea that many people who fought long and hard for bills like the Launch Services Purchase Act is that the government purchase services, they do not fund and build operational vehicles. Now, if X-34 had no operational mission, you would have no opposition from those people. But it is clearly an operational vehicle because NASA has said so, Rockwell has said so, Orbital Sciences has said so. And if you ask people like Lockheed with their the LLV, or Pac Astro, people like that, who are competing in the same market niche for the small satellite contracts. They'll say this is hurting them from their development. And so I understand what you're saying about keeping the message clear to Congress, but the bottom line is we are trying to enable private companies to do this, and we see X-34 as the government subsidizing an operational vehicle, which is what we oppose. We do not oppose research and development. So hopefully we can talk about X-34 later on. Like I said, that's not quite the sole issue at hand.
I'd like to bring up a point, if I may. I figure a forum is for this type of thing anyway. There is another aspect of the private sector that is being ignored. Small businesses, such as Amrock and other even smaller businesses that are working on commercial rockets. And of course, as many of you can probably understand where I'm coming from, the amateur space rocketry and spacecraft efforts. ESS is certainly not the only one involved. I can think of half a dozen rocket groups and dozens of universities and private organizations looking at putting spacecraft into orbit who only need a cheap rocket, such as what amateur rocketry can provide, to get into orbit, or at least could provide. There are groups that are working on that. So any comments regarding that, the total ignorance in the space, amateur space and small business involvement would certainly help our efforts and other groups' efforts in achieving some success.
Yeah, Linda, you're right. The fact that those kind of activities are not really publicized very well. However, two associate members of the California Space Development Council are the Pacific Rocket Society and the Experimental Rocket Propulsion Society, both in California, who are trying to break the 50-mile barrier into space with an amateur rocket. And I think things like that, things like the AMSAT people are important in breaking the paradigm that NASA is space, that the government is space. I believe Jeff Landis, either later today or tomorrow, will be talking about a project called Space Cub, which is looking at essentially doing for the rocket community what experimental aircraft have done for the home builders, basically building a home-built rocket that somebody can fly. Just to that.
Yeah, Dr. Webb, what strikes me as you've been presenting us is that with the classic bait and switch. You told us the key to opening up the space industry is a market-driven approach. You told us that NASA should be confined basic research. And you coupled that with a plea for funding for X-34, which is an anti-market approach. I'm trying to understand that basic.
Excuse me, I have not made a plea for funding for X-34. I made a statement that the funding for X-34 has already been made.
It has not been. Congress has yet to vote on the $70 million.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
Oh, okay. Well, then that being the case, I mean, if the space community is now going to go to the Congress and stop the funding for the X-34, we've got ourselves a real pickle.
You're in a pickle.
Yeah. And I would suggest that as we've shot ourselves in the foot about 9 times out of 10, if we ever take a step forward, we should think very, very carefully before we go and do that. In this Congress at this time, where they're cutting, and they want to cut the entire space program. You heard the gentleman, and it won't just be the NASA space program that'll get cut, it will be the American space program that'll get cut.
If you're working to save the stuff that's important, you got to give up the stuff that search for the X-34 is going to hurt. You back to the space.
Look, do you think that the X-34 is so significant that you are willing to give up the space program for it?
If you phrase it that way, of course not. But
Well, of course not.
reality does not conform to what
Why?
you say.
Why don't you think? Do you think that?
X-34 will be canceled, and yet we will have a space program next year.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. But look, do you think that it is worthwhile trying to fight a battle over this amount of money because you think it's an operational vehicle?
NASA says an operational vehicle.
But that is fine. It isn't an operational vehicle run by the government.
It's still NASA an operational
You
vehicle.
see, I don't see the difference. The X-34 is going to be operated by a private company. What was the difference between the government supporting the development of airplanes all the way through the period, giving money to Boeing, giving money to McDonnell Douglas, and having airplanes built? What is the difference? They're operated by the private
To be
sector.
operated by a private company doesn't mean it was a mistake too.
I believe this is another hostility room.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because I don't understand the situation at all. Yes.
I just want to make a comment on X33 versus X34. I worked on NASDAQ in the 80s, and I worked on...
We can't hear you back here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I worked on NASDAQ in the 80s for McDonnell Douglas, and I worked on the SSTO proposals phase 1, and I've just been kind of keeping in touch with it, though I'm no longer working on those programs. I think one concern that I would have, I don't care about X34 data. It gets funds great, it doesn't, well, whatever.
Yeah.
What upsets me about what I'm seeing in the X34 program is I see it being used by some people, especially at Marshall, as sort of a vehicle. So while we have this operational vehicle, we think that some of the technology should be flowing back and forth from X33 and X34. And why don't we make X33 a two-stage vehicle? That would be a third two-stage reusable vehicle. We've got one, the shuttle. X34 is 2. Let's not do that with X33. That's not what X33 is all about.
Absolutely.
That's a concern I have with X34. I don't care about funding, but I want to see X34 be a vehicle to turn X33 into shuttle 2.
I agree, 100%. And obviously, that is what we should definitely battle, and it is already underway. And as you know, Golden himself has made certain decisions regarding who does what at Marshall, and has cut them right out of the thing. Mansfield sent out a letter and so on. Of course, we don't want that to happen, and it should not be used internally in NASA as a weapon to stop anything. That is, I agree 100%, but as an operational vehicle, it's going to be a privately operated vehicle. It isn't going to be a government one. Yeah, sorry, I don't want to stop. Yes, I think.
Right here.
Oh,
I have a certain frustration, and I think a lot of people share, that leads me to want to bend steel beams with my bare hands.
That's a big truth.
Which is that year after year, we come to these conferences, we hear proposals that truly do not cost very much money. The cost of one, you will pardon the adjective, stinking shuttle flight per year out of NASA's budget, if 5–10% of their budget, if it were devoted to any of these concepts, we would be somewhere fairly soon. How is it that we cannot get NASA or anybody else to devote such a small fraction of their budget to the necessary research and development to actually get somewhere? Would you like to take that, Bob?
Had more success being massive. Want to do than anybody else in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and very small portion of their budget. The point's an excellent one, and just to repeat what I said, we could subsidize the development of 10 new reusable launch vehicles of alternative approaches to launching payloads in the X-34 class with 2% of NASA's budget. Okay? Now,
So why can't we get the 2%?
well, I think we need to fight for it. Let me tell you something. This same question has been raised in the planetary missions community, okay? That is the community of people who send orbiters to Mars and Jupiter and so on, which also, by the way, is an extremely small percent of NASA's budget. Even with Cassini-class probes, it's an extremely small percent. With Discovery missions, okay, they're trying to start this Discovery program, which is for $150 million class planetary missions. They're going to get one every other year, $75 million a year. Once again, one postage stamp for every American, $75 million a year, 0.5% of NASA's budget. And yet, if people in a year when a Discovery mission flies ask, what did NASA do this year? They'd say, well, they sent a probe to an asteroid. well, they landed Pathfinder on Mars. So that 1% is getting all the headlines, and not just for reasons of being a limelight hog, but because in fact it's probably the most important thing they did. Now, but the planetary scientists fought for discovery, because initially there was no discovery program, and they're fighting for it, and they're trying to expand it, and they hope to eventually get it to a launch every year, then 2 a year, and so on. I think we need to fight for it. I mean, look, it's that simple. The problem's a larger one, okay? The problem, put simply, is this, okay? We are not organized, okay? I'll tell you, I go around and I give talks on sending humans to Mars, and not just to space groups, but to to public groups, Rotary clubs and things that represent an arbitrary cross-section of the population. And I find there's uniform support for an aggressive space program that will colonize the solar system. That this is what most people think we ought to be doing. There's a general hegemonic vision in our society right now that the future should be like Star Trek, where people live in space and go all over the place, okay? That is what people believe. We have a majority, and yet we're completely helpless. Here you have NASA attempting to adapt to, a budgetary downsizing, which is projected to, decrease 10% a year for the indefinite future, and so on. And we seem to be unable to do it. We have, these other groups, which frankly are more marginal in the population than we are. Okay, I'll tell you, there are less people in this country. I believe this. There are less people in this country who want prayer in the public schools than who want humans throughout the solar system. Really? Okay, but we have got to start thinking in this society how to get organized. Because then if we make it clear what our agenda is, okay, that this is our agenda, and this agenda does require dropping the cost to orbit by a factor of 100, which we can start out by dropping it a factor 2, and then another factor 2, and another factor 2, that this is what's important to us, okay, and that yes, we ought to get a larger fraction of NASA's budget, and in fact NASA's budget is too small. It is. Now it's true they could do more with it if they spent it in ways we want, but really it's 1% of the federal budget, and I think that, frankly, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, people look back at this time, the most important thing that this country will be seen as having done in this period of human history is the space program. Okay? These other things, the national health program or the prayer and public school program and so on, won't even be known except perhaps to scholars that people were even talking about this stuff. So we need to organize. That's what we need to do. We got to really start thinking about how we can wield the kind of latent political support there is in the American population, a support that I believe is in fact even the majority of the population. It's a very large support, and we somehow have not addressed how we're going to organize it and wield it.
As I understand it, this is a forum on private launches, correct?
Sure. So what do you want to say?
Does anyone up there have an opinion as to whether or not we are going to require significant government assistance in the pooling of resources through government to colonize? And if your answer is that we do need significant government assistance to colonize, then it's wrong, I think, to try to eliminate government from the mix. So I would like to comment.
Well, I agree with you. And if you look at the history of colonization of America, or Australia, there was massive government subsidies in all phases of it. Okay? Now we have here a more difficult task, and one in which private returns are more remote. We're going to need government subsidies and government support in various ways, and we should not, out of some purist notions, spurn it.
I'd like to follow up a little bit on that. We cannot, by law, eliminate government from space colonization, nor indeed from space launching, because we have already signed that right away in 1967 at the United Nations, and so has all the other nations on Earth. The government is responsible for every single thing launched by an American citizen anywhere, anytime on Earth. The government is responsible. So we can't eliminate the government, and it is a fallacious even thought to even consider it. We are beholden to the government for every single thing we do. The government will be in control of all space colonies, no matter where they are, and all citizens on a space colony will be responsible to the government. The American citizens to the American government. If the real thing that hasn't been finally battled out yet is that when the United Nations is faced with a colony that is built by 15 or 20 or 25 nations, it's going to get rid of them. But the actual launch, the place from where it is launched, is responsible at the present. So, hey, we can't get rid of government. Nobody wants to do that. What we need to do is to get them to stop the stupid regulations that they've got at the present time, which is actually, you cannot go to space right now. You can't. Even if you had the launch vehicle, not unless you went to the government and they told you you could go. Now that's the one we need to stop. Sorry, I think this gentleman. Oh, sorry, he had something to add to that, I think.
I just had a follow-up. My real question is, don't you think you need subsidies from the government? I mean, that's really the issue, isn't it? How much money are you going to get from those? You know,
I don't think we need subsidies. The Ford Motor Company spent $7 billion on designing the Contour. That's one automobile. Sure, it's a world automobile. $7 billion. Boeing spent $9 billion on the 777. I mean, hey, we can launch the Delta Clipper for about $5. So it's not a big deal. I mean, this is not big money in private sector language. If you look at every single night, there are about 795 million shares in this company that changes hands in this country. Every day on the stock exchange. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. Flip every single day, flipping around like that. That's all private money. There's lots of it out there. The only thing is we have to give them a decent return. If we give them a decent return, we'll get more money than we can shake a stick at. That's the real trick.
Yeah, I don't think anyone is advocating the complete elimination of the government in the space field. That'll never happen. That doesn't even happen out on the highways. What we want is the government to spend the money smartly and in a way that enables the private sector through, say, looking at the airline analogy of the Kelly Act, where the government purchased services that enabled the private sector. They purchased flight of airmails, that kind of stuff. So that's what we're looking for. So in a sense, you know, it's a subsidy, the purchase of services. So just follow. Nobody, and I agree with 90%, 99% of what my colleagues up here are saying. But I think, at least from some of the space activists' point of view, is we want the government to spend the money smart and in a way that does not hinder private development. And we agree that, you know, some of the regulations have got to be streamlined. And that's an action that we have to take as an activist community to work on.
in the back.
Yeah, aside from the government budget, the point about this huge river of private money that can go into something when economic conditions warrant is right on. Is there any effort in terms of trying to get the Office of Commercial Space Transportation to develop a user-friendly set of regulations and licensing procedures, so it's more like getting a plane license for commercial use. Is that even beginning to be talked about at OCST?
Yes, it's been talked about. Actually, if you talk to them now, they'll tell you it's an awful lot more friendly than it used to be, and that's possibly true. The only problem is it's not anything like friendly enough. And the DOT and the DOC have got really big responsibilities in this thing. The problem is going to come when we are going to have to certify a passenger vehicle. Then the problem really hits the note. Because the DOT is going to have to be responsible, just through the Federal Aviation Administration as they are for airplanes, in certifying airplanes. They're going to have to certify a spacecraft as being fit for taking citizens out to space. It is going to be incredibly costly. We reckon on the NAS that it would take about 8 years for the DOT to be able to do that for one vehicle.
Yeah.
That'll be the first one.
Yeah.
They would have to, and it will be, it is a jungle, you know? They are going to have to, and the trouble about it is that though we're saying, please remove regulations, on the other hand, obviously the government is going to impose regulations on the type of materials that are used in building vehicles which are going to carry passengers. And that is going to be an arduous regulation, and it's going to cost a great deal of money, unfortunately. And the first company that goes to the government and says, we want you to certify the Delta Clipper or something else, better have deep pockets and a lot of patience, I feel. But otherwise, they are trying to reduce it to some extent, I believe. Yes?
Will the time come for NGOs, whatever their base is, commercial or hobbyist, subscriber-supported, etc., maybe even group box office supported, as one of the groups is trying to do with Artemis, to, in effect, abrogate, at least in their own effort, specifically not comply with that item of the 1977 treaty which you just cited. Try to succeed and not comply.
It will be very difficult. You know, I know there are some people in this country who really believe that the United Nations is going to take us over. I don't think that really that is happening. Nonetheless, we do have to live with our fellow humans here, and we do have to agree on certain modes of conduct as we have in aviation. And the fact is that aviation is an extremely constrained and regulated industry. There are certain ways in which airplanes can fly, as you all know, and there are only certain ways in which they can fly. We're going to have exactly the same thing in space. We cannot prevent it. I mean, one of the big problems, even talking about the NAS, and I keep harking back to that because there have been studies on this, the fact of the matter was what was going to happen when you have a hypersonic vehicle take off and fly right through the entire airspace of the United States, increasing its speed from 400 miles an hour up to Mach 25 as it flew out at 180,000 feet. It had just covered the entire territory. In fact, it was impossible to turn the NAS without going from the Pacific to the Atlantic and back over the American continent again. Coming back in, that vehicle is going to cut through the entire airspace of most of the terrestrial, of most of the Earth. It would start letting down somewhere over Indonesia, and it would have to be over the Atlantic and come back in to land on the West Coast. So we are talking about some very sexist problems here. And there will be problems which will have to be controlled by some government, intra-government agency, some international agency. We're not going to be the only ones launching these vehicles. And we're going to have to agree with other nations. And that's the only reason that the Outer Space Affairs Division in the United Nations works, or is in process.
In the green shirt.
What about the regulation of unmanned vehicles? I know that the U.S. has long sort of driven their program towards manned space exploration, but what about vehicles that are running robotic or other such payloads up in orbit, which can be quite useful and augment a manned station or sort of program.
I think they're regularly unrestrained even now. You're supposed to you must let your government know. You must have a government permission to launch. That is for sure.
Right.
And that is the one big restraint. Then the government is supposed to register that launch with the United Nations, which it usually does way after the fact. And so there's no real restraint there. But so long as the government says you can launch, you can launch. It will be made quite different when you get something like the Delta Clipper that doesn't have to launch from the Kennedy Space Center or from Vandenberg. Now we've interjected something totally new in there because of the problem of overflight over a city or an inhabited area. Rocket vehicles are not allowed to overfly an inhabited area. And that is going to be a problem because the Delta Clipper would have the perfect capability to be just as safe as an airplane. And so those regulations we're going to have to battle, but that will all be a part of the certification process. And that's what makes it so long, I think.
In the back.
I work with the Department of Transportation, and one of the things that OCST is facing at the moment is the reorganization of the department. They, as current plans are right now, going to be absorbed into the Federal Aviation Administration. Now, you can see this as good news or bad news because the FAA does have talent at certifying large passenger carrying vehicles in short times. But there are a lot of other questions around that, and anyone looking at the issue of the United States government's involvement in authorization of space flight should take this into account.
That's very interesting news. That decision has been made, has it?
The plans have been drawn up by Secretary Pena's office, have been distributed to the rank and file, and seem to be pretty well underway.
For better or for worse? In sickness or in health?
Just to state that the financing of the space program and all the budgetary constraints that we talk about is the smaller issue. The bigger issue is cultural priority. And to put things in perspective, just a 20% reduction in tobacco and alcohol use would bring about $100 billion, which is 7 times more than the entire NASA budget. Cultural priority, let's go.
Dave, I'd like to make a point that's relevant here, I think. The distinction between certifying an aircraft and a spacecraft was brought home quite clearly when they were trying to get permission to launch the first DCX out of White Sands. And the range safety officer said, well, where is your explosive mechanism to destroy this craft if it gets out of the way? And they convinced him that it was not a rocket, but it was an airplane. and that it was going to be tested like an airplane, up and down, up and down. And so that it was certified to be tested as an airplane. Now, if that philosophy follows through on the rest of the DCX development, then you see you got a whole different way of looking at how those kinds of launches would be certified and would solve the problem of overflight of populated areas and so forth. So I just thought I'd bring up that little tidbit.
Yes, respond. Glenn, thank you very much. That's a very important point. The thing is, though, you bring up range safety. Range safety is under the Air Force. And here is a tremendous problem facing us right now. And anybody who lives within 100 miles of the Kennedy Space Center, as I do, we meet up with this all the time. The single greatest impediment to private launching right now from the Cape, and the single reason which drives most of our corporations to use the Ariane, is the fact that they have to go through the Air Force regulations to launch from the Kennedy Space Center. If you do not do it 3 years in advance of your launch date, you're not going to make it. You have 3 years of total hassle, filling endless forms, responding to endless questions, and at the end of it all, you can get bumped anytime by the Air Force for DoD reasons or whatever. And that is one of the major regulations that has to be changed, is that we've got to get the Air Force out of the business of controlling national airspace, which is civilian airspace, and go back to just controlling military airspace. And if we don't do that, we probably won't be launching civilian space program very many people into space at all. It's a real toughie. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like you guys to comment on two ideas. One of them that I've heard about recently is suborbital passenger rockets, and the other one is the idea of launching over international waters. Could you comment on those, please?
I'll comment on one of them, which is suborbital passenger rockets. I think it's an excellent idea. In fact, I believe that in order to achieve really strong reductions in launch costs, okay, you're going to need to have a space industry that does launches not once a week, which is about how often things are launched now, or once a day, or even 10 times a day, but thousands of times a day. Okay, that's what you're going to need. You're going to have. I once was looking at a vehicle that needed to use as auxiliary propulsion a certain kind of jet engine, and I was looking into this jet engine, and I'm basically a rocket guy, not a jet guy. So this was a little new to me, and I found out how many of these jet engines were in inventory in the United States. And the answer was 16,000, which is an astounding number to someone used to what there might be inventory in a certain kind of rocket engine. Okay, I mean, astounding by 3 orders of magnitude. Okay, now. And you think how many airplanes there are flying around the U.S. right now. Okay, interesting figure. Do you know how many Americans flew on airplanes last year? 2 billion. 2 billion, okay? The number of, you could evacuate the United States by air without increasing our existing flight rate within 6 weeks. That's the rate at which airplanes are flying around right now in the United States. Now, that defines a certain rate of production for airplanes and jet engines and landing gears and and the whole economy of scale associated with that, which is why you can fly coast to coast for $300 or some number on that order. Now, if you want to have space transportation costs of that order, you have to have launch rates that are comparable. You have to have not one Delta Clipper taking a payload to orbit twice a week, which of course would be excellent for one Delta Clipper to do, but you need to have thousands of Delta Clippers flying all over the place a couple of times a day. Now, there aren't that many payloads that want to go to orbit. Even if you had space hotels, there wouldn't be that many payloads that want to go to orbit. Because, but there are that many people that want to go to Tahiti. Okay, that is, or similar places. That is, there aren't 1 million people that want to go to orbit, but there are 1 million people that want to go to Hawaii this year. Okay, and millions more that want to go New York to Tokyo. Okay, and London to Sydney, and so forth and so on. So, I believe that the bridge to the future for creating a space industry which has economies of scale, these numbers, is surface-to-surface transportation. Now, as far as what that means technically, in my view, that's probably a very strong argument for wings, as opposed to vertical takeoff, vertical landing. Now, there are those that would argue at this point, but my basic point there is that if you are talking surface to surface, There's literally trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure in place right now around the world in the forms of airports and surrounding hotels, parking lots, highways to them and from them. I mean, where are you going to get land to build a spaceport near New York City? Okay? Sure. All right, there you go. So, if you could use the existing airports, you're way ahead. Now, perhaps if vertical takeoff vehicles have sufficient technical advantages, that could be argued the other way. But I think that this is a very important thing, and it'd be a very important direction for private development of space launch systems to move towards.
You have the other. You asked about the international waters. Okay, sea launch. Sea launch is a great idea, and obviously it's going to happen. I mean, Boeing is going to make it a reality, and I think that that's a tremendous achievement. It's also going to open up a whole new way. You can launch from the sea. You're still responsible. Boeing will be responsible to the United States, which is why they are now asking the United States to remove the, if they are responsible, then the United States now is faced with the problem. They cannot quota the launches that are going to be made by Boeing using Russian technology. So the Russians have a way out of the cap that we have put on the Russian launch capabilities, using launching Western goods on their satellites by getting Boeing, who is fronting for them, which is pretty smart. And you launch from the sea or international, you actually can do a lot of different things doing that. You fall under a whole different legal regime in the United Nations, by the way.
I'd like to correct Bob just on one thing. There's absolutely no reason why a vertical lander can't land at a regular airport. It doesn't have to have wings. In fact, the most likely destination point for a vertical lander would be an existing airport. It's some place that's not right directly on the runway, perhaps, but because you do have that infrastructure already in place that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I'm on the World Trade Center. It's got a big round target.
But still in all major airports now have vast acreages encompassed in their borders, and there's plenty of area for a vertical lander to come down in that and not disrupt the existing patterns at all.
I would just say that there's noise problems associated with
Noise. That's a problem. You can have noise is a problem anywhere.
I just want to make one quick comment on what Bob Zubrin mentioned about the markets that were going to space, and that there wouldn't be enough people to make things like space hotels and things like that really be a major industry. We were talking last night in Hospitality Suite about the space community has to become more market savvy and understand things like that. And when the China Clippers, the flying boats, were going out to Tahiti, there were not millions of people who wanted to go to Hawaii because they couldn't. They could not envision themselves doing that. If you build a vehicle that the private sector runs that people can envision going to orbit, they will.
Ben, remember Charles Miller's number of, there was a survey done in Japan a couple of years back on space tourism. And they asked them if you could spend $10,000 and spend a week in a space hotel, would you? And they came up with, I think, 1 million passengers a year out of Japan alone for that price of a ticket. So if the costs get down, there is the market on that.
Derek Green back here, that? No. Why don't you might stand up?
Okay. We were talking back in March when we were lobbying on the Hill, and there was a study done in Japan for passenger travel to orbit. And they found that at a $10,000 ticket price, Japanese alone would send 1 million people a year into orbit. Now that's a great reduction in cost, but if the costs come down, there is the market. And that's again just Japan.
Okay, I got one data point for you. In California, we have the same problem that Patrick Air Force Base has in Vandenberg. They're very unfriendly to private launches. In fact, I believe they charge Amrock $800,000 to use the pad experiment in 1989. The solution to that was to essentially address the threat that they would put on the base closure list. When that happened, they turned the erratic machine to 180 degrees, and now it's blindly changed anybody wants to use a spaceport. plethora of commercial launches scheduled for granting. So that's one solution to make it. So the point I wanted to make is, we're
Can you
talking
talk
about
louder,
government.
please?
Yeah. Oh, self-heard. Okay. We briefly touched on the market. I just want to relay the impression that of all the people in this room run out to their congressman and deal with the regulatory issues, that we're going to have a thriving space market tomorrow. I don't want to come back a year from now having something we do that and be sitting around going, well, why aren't we in space? We still have to address the market issues. Yeah, there's a ton of potential market, but we're at a situation now that we need to jumpstart this market. And the ideal way to do that is to have the government, wherever possible, incent markets. The Discovery Program is a good example. If you have dozens of planetary probes going throughout the solar system, you've got a great opportunity for more launches. We need to push the government to incent the market wherever possible. Launch of its first step, but we need to fight for as many launches as possible out of that government budget. That's what we need to do. You got to create the market for these new companies to build new flying rockets. That's the solution. We've got to get working on that as soon as possible.
Comments? Yes, sir.
Getting back to the wings vertical takeoff, vertical landing controversy and markets, I think Bob Zubrin is correct that the point-to-point market would sort of favor wings, but point-to-point I don't think is the only market to be considered, especially when once things are going. Space tourism isn't going to stop at low Earth orbit. You're going to be going to the moon, you're going to be going to hotels in space. Eventually there's going to be significant infrastructure out there. You're going to be using materials. You're going to be getting your oxygen from the moon. If you consider solar power satellites, even the light mass solar power satellites that Seth Potter is considering, they too would benefit considerably from a considerable amount of traffic above the atmosphere. And if you consider this traffic, it would benefit from, if you could land on the moon. Wings aren't going to help you there. And so the vertical takeoff, vertical landing is more versatile. And so if you consider these kinds of markets, that would sort of lean it the other way. So I don't know.
I think one of the key things, you're very right in what you're saying, I think one of the key things, say, about X-33 is not to decide which is better, vertical landing or horizontal landing. That's for the market to decide. The purpose of a program like X-33 is to show that you can do a vertical landing and you can do a horizontal landing within certain parameters. And yet let whatever company is going to build the vehicle work with the people who are going to purchase the services, work with the market.
Black horse, spacecraft worth fighting for. Who's going to fight for it? Who's going to build it? Any private interest in building it so far?
The question is about Black Horse, which is a space plane that takes off from a runway, flies to altitude where it takes on all its oxidizer, and then punches up from there to orbit, and then comes in and lands at a runway. So it's horizontal takeoff, horizontal landing, but the gimmick of using aerial transfer of the oxidizer allows you to shrink the airframe and landing gear radically so that it doesn't encounter the same penalties that would ordinarily be encountered in a horizontal takeoff single-stage orbit vehicle, which would ordinarily preclude such a vehicle from being practical. This concept was first proposed by Mitch Clapp, captain in the Air Force, by the way, is also a pilot of the DCX. He's flown it. And there's a great deal of interest in the Air Force in this vehicle because in addition to having orbital launch capabilities, It has the capability of doing a wide array of military missions in the area of long-range reconnaissance, interception, and strike that are quite remarkable. And it was a recommendation of the Spacecast 2020 study. The Air Force recently concluded that such a vehicle should be developed. Mitch is currently fighting a fight within the Air Force to get this funded. There are a lot of senior officers who like it. There are also others who aren't. And basically, you know, you have more or less 4 schools. One says the rockets we have now, that Titans and Atlases and Deltas and things are good enough. Just maybe improve them a little bit. Another favors the evolution of the DCX approach, using hydrogen oxygen. You wouldn't want to use hydrogen oxygen in a Black Horse. Hydrogen is much too bulky for efficient packaging into an airplane fuselage of this sort. You'd want to use either kerosene oxygen or kerosene and hydrogen peroxide. Then there is the Black Horse crowd, and then finally there's the crowd who prefers regular fighter aircraft and wonders what we need satellites for anyway. Yeah, and they are in the majority, yes. So it's unclear where that's going to go. You know, I think that the vehicle, because it has versatility, then that it can do missions besides space launch as such. You know, it can do all these military missions and even fast package delivery, surface to surface on Earth. I think there is real commercial potential there, and I think it'd be something that the private investors might want us to think about.
Sir, for Ben, I wonder if you want to emphasize for this group what we stressed in Washington, D.C. about getting a fly-off between 2 or more vehicles from the X-33 programs.
I think you can do that, John.
Okay, well, one thing we're as part of our congressional visits, we're describing getting funding for the X-33 program, but what we want to do is get a little more funding to leverage that extra money to get 2 vehicles developed, and that would allow for more than one concept to be tested. And I noticed we had this big debate here a while ago about like vertical and horizontal takeoff and landing. So there could be 2 radically different designs tested. Both could be flown, and even both might eventually be developed in the commercial market for different applications.
I agree with what Joe said.
Well, I agree it's a good idea, except that NASA didn't have enough money to do that. They would have had a fly-off. You know, there was a lot of discussion about that at the beginning as to whether there should be a fly-off. People say, unfortunately, it takes a lot more time and a lot more money. And I guess that's a call that somebody has to make. It certainly is a more effective thing. It's how airplanes have been done, that's for sure. But it is more effective, it is more costly, and it is more time-consuming.
Yeah, let me just follow up. We were on the Department of Defense to spend money to do that. We sort of felt this wall that's been put up in space policy between the reasonable launch vehicle side of NASA and expendable launch vehicle upgrades for DoD is a little bit artificial.
Well, that's good.
To address that issue, I know one of the ideas that's been floating around, and particularly I know Jim Muncie is interested in it, is possibly rather than restructuring the whole X-33 program into more of a prize sort of thing. Because that would be instant competition. Maybe if you can come up with a little bit more money, you might be able to get more entrants into it.
I think I'm on the McDonnell Douglas Boeing team. As a matter of fact, I'm chief engineer of the ROV. And when that was first broached to the teams, you got a universal response, which was no, that we don't like that idea. And the reason is that we're not competing for a prize here. We're competing for an opportunity to spend our own money. And so we would much rather see instead of a fly-off, does 2 things. It halves the amount of money that we can spend during the X-33 phase to reduce risk. And like it or not, we're a commercial enterprise. We're profit oriented. If we don't show a profit, we're not here long. Secondly, we're going to have to spend major money. You know, we're talking somewhere between $5 and $10 billion to develop an ROV. And the last thing we want is to have someone else do an X-33 so we have the market. That's what was wrong with the L-1011 and the DC-10, is you put Lockheed out of business, essentially, for commercial, and you seriously hurt Douglas to the point where they were bought out by McDonnell. And it was done because there were two identical airplanes competing for a market that wasn't big enough. And believe me, when space transportation starts out, that's not going to be a big market. Matter of fact, I'm the next speaker and I'll get into that. So that's why all three teams opposed the idea of a flyout. It sounds good if we were competing for a large government prize. We're not. We're competing for an opportunity to spend our own money in a very risky market. And you guys maybe should have talked to us before you ran out and made that proposal.
Exhausted it? Well, thank you to our panel here. Well done discussion.